The fluorescent lights of San Francisco International Airport cast artificial daylight across Terminal G, creating that peculiar liminal space where time seemed to suspend itself between destinations. It was 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, that shoulder season when summer tourists had vanished and holiday travelers had yet to arrive. Rain streaked the massive windows overlooking the tarmac, distorting the runway lights into watery constellations against the night sky. Mason Drake stood at his customary position near the international arrivals gate, shoulders squared beneath his dark blue Customs and Border Protection uniform. At 42, he carried himself with the disciplined posture of someone who had spent years in positions of authority, though the slight lines at the corners of his eyes revealed a capacity for humor that surveillance cameras couldn't capture. A titanium rod in his right leg, souvenir from an IED in Fallujah 15 years earlier, occasionally announced itself with a dull ache during weather changes, and tonight the incoming storm was making its presence known. Beside him, Nova maintained her own vigil. The Belgian Malinois sat with perfect stillness, amber eyes tracking the movements of weary travelers with an intelligence that sometimes unnerved those who noticed it. Her sleek fawn coat gleamed under the harsh lighting, the black mask around her eyes, lending her an air of perpetual concentration. Unlike the German shepherds that dominated the CBP's K9 units, Nova's lighter frame allowed her a quickness and agility that suited the complex choreography of airport security. "Last flight of the night, girl," Drake murmured, his voice pitched for Nova's ears alone. "Seoul's been delayed again, probably weather over the Pacific." Nova's ears twitched in acknowledgement, but her attention remained fixed on the thinning crowd from the Cancun arrival they had just finished processing. Their day had begun 14 hours earlier with a 5 a.m. training session, followed by a full schedule of international flights that should have concluded at 10:30 p.m. The Seoul delay had pushed them well past their scheduled shift end into that zone of fatigue, where experience had to compensate for diminished alertness. Supervisor Elaine Garcia approached her short practical haircut and minimal makeup, emphasizing her no-nonsense demeanor. At 56, she had navigated the complexities of a male-dominated agency with the precision of someone who understood that excellence left no room for excuses. "Flight's showing another 30 minutes, she said, consulting her tablet. "I can call in Thompson if you want to clock out, Adpi." Drake shook his head. "We'll finish what we started." "Nova gets restless when someone else handles the last flight on our rotation." Garcia's expression softened slightly. "You anthropomorphize that dog more than your ex-wife did with her chihuahua. Difference is Nova actually does have human-level perception." Drake replied with the comfortable banter of longtime colleagues. "Those rat dogs just had entitlement complexities." Nova looked up at the sound of her name, then returned to her surveillance, a model of professional focus that made Drake's point more effectively than any rebuttal. "Chateauine. Coffee." Garcia offered, gesturing toward the staff break room. "Thanks, Black, with welcome. 2 sugars and a splash of half and half that you pretend doesn't count as cream." Garcia finished with a knowing smile. "Some of us actually notice details without 4 legs and a tail." As Garcia departed, Drake conducted a subtle stretch to ease the tightness in his right leg. The rain was intensifying, drumming against the massive windows and sheets now. He checked the monitors again. Seoul flight delayed another 15 minutes, now showing a midnight arrival. Around him, the terminal had emptied of all but a few stragglers, an elderly couple dozing against each other on molded plastic seats, a businessman furiously typing on a laptop, and a maintenance worker methodically emptying trash receptacles. Drake used the quiet moment to mentally review their day. The morning flight from Amsterdam had yielded 2 separate marijuana interceptions, college students returning from predictable adventures abroad. The early afternoon arrival from Bogota had been clean, somewhat surprisingly given the historical patterns. A family returning from Thailand had surrendered several prohibited fruit items they'd failed to declare, routine work important but unremarkable. The most interesting moment had come during the Mexico City flight, when Nova had alerted on a middle-aged woman's handbag. Instead of drugs or contraband food, they discovered prescription medications in quantities that significantly exceeded personal use. The woman had broken down immediately, explaining they were for her sister's cancer treatment medications that cost 1/10 in Mexico what they did in the US. Drake had followed protocol documenting the seizure, but had also quietly provided information about pharmaceutical assistance programs before sending her on her way with a warning rather than more severe consequences. Garcia returned with coffee, interrupting his thoughts. Seoul finally cleared for landing 20 minutes out. Namarchina por Idranan. Drake accepted the cup gratefully, noting that despite her teasing, Garcia had prepared it exactly as he preferred. Thanks, Nova's been a bit restless the past hour, probably sensing my impatience to finish up. Garcia observed the Malinois, who had indeed been showing subtle signs of increased alertness. Ears more frequently shifting position, occasional soft whines, less settled in her sitting posture. Maybe she's picking up on something else. Garcia suggested that intuition of hers. 3 years earlier, such a comment would have earned a skeptical reaction from Garcia, who had initially viewed Drake's assertions about Nova's special perceptiveness as handler bias. But too many incidents had accumulated, too many cases where Nova had alerted on anomalies that weren't part of her training protocol, but represented genuine security concerns for even the most empirically minded supervisor to dismiss. Possible, Drake acknowledged, sipping his coffee. Though sometimes a restless dog is just ready for her dinner in bed, like her handler. Garcia smiled. Well, you've got time for a proper break before they deplane. I'll hold down the fort. Take 15. Drake nodded gratefully and gestured to Nova. Come on, girl, quick walk before the final push. They made their way through employee corridors to the small outdoor area designated for canine relief breaks. The rain had momentarily subsided, leaving a glistening sheen across the concrete and a fresh, washed scent that provided welcome relief from the recycled terminal air. Nova completed her business efficiently, then stood alert, nose working the wind currents with apparent interest. What is it? Drake asked, recognizing the particular quality of her attention. Not the focused alertness of detecting a trained scent, but the broader curiosity about something unexpected. Nova turned to look at him briefly, then back toward the distant runway, where landing lights were now visible through the broken clouds, the delayed Seoul flight finally approaching. Yeah, I know one more than home, Drake assured her, misinterpreting her interest as impatience. They returned to Terminal G just as the first passengers began emerging through the jet bridge, carrying the distinctive fatigue of a trans-Pacific journey. Drake positioned himself and Nova at their usual screening location, watching as travelers began queuing for customs and immigration processing. The flight was surprisingly full for an off-season weekday, mostly Korean nationals visiting family in the Bay Area. A scattering of American business travelers returning from tech conferences in the usual assortment of students and tourists. Drake observed the crowd with practiced eyes, looking for behavioral indicators that often revealed more than the contraband itself. The excessive nonchalance of someone with something to hide, the specific tension around the eyes of travelers, caring more than they should, the subtle tells of those preparing explanations they'd rehearsed but didn't believe. Nova worked methodically alongside him, moving through the standard screening pattern they'd refined over years of partnership. She showed mild interest in a university student's backpack, but it was her curious but not alerting behavior that usually indicated nothing more serious than food residue or traces of cannabis, too minimal to warrant formal inspection. Halfway through processing the passengers, Nova's demeanor shifted. Her ears pricked forward, body tensing with sudden attention. She turned her head sharply toward the far end of the terminal, where the final passengers were emerging from the jet bridge. Drake followed her gaze to a young woman who had just entered, pushing a navy blue stroller with one hand while clutching a large shoulder bag with the other. Even at a distance, something about her immediately caught his professional attention. Unlike the typical travel fatigue displayed by other passengers, her movements appeared jittery, eyes constantly scanning in rapid, darting glances. Despite the terminal's cool air conditioning, sweat glistened on her forehead. Her fingers gripped the stroller handle with white-knuckle intensity. "Nova check," Drake said quietly, the command that initiated their inspection routine. The Malinois responded instantly, moving into her searching pattern as they circled toward the woman. As they drew closer, Drake could hear the fussing of an infant in the stroller, a sound of discomfort rather than typical baby crankiness. The woman's reaction to their approach was equally telling. Most passengers either ignored the K9 or watched with mild curiosity. This woman immediately tried to maneuver the stroller away, creating distance between Nova and the baby, with an urgency that seemed excessive. "Is there a problem?" she called out, voice pitched too high. "Can you keep that dog away from my baby, please?" "Just routine, ma'am," Drake replied, maintaining a casual tone. "Where are you arriving from today?" "Seoul," she answered quickly, too quickly. "Direct flight." Drake noticed her accent, American English, with subtle inflections suggesting Korean as her first language. Though she appeared fully fluent, her passport would tell the full story, but that would come later in the processing queue. "Beautiful baby you've got there," Drake said, taking a step to the side as if merely continuing his patrol. "Boy or girl?" "Boy," the woman answered, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He's 7 months old." Drake glanced at the infant who was squirming uncomfortably in the stroller, face reddened from crying. "He seems uncomfortable. Long flight for a little one." "He has a bit of a stomachache," she explained rapidly. "Plus the pressure changes during landing." The flight attendants tried to help, but nothing seemed to work. Drake nodded sympathetically. "First time flying with him?" "Yes," she replied, visible relief flooding her features at this apparent explanation for her nervousness. "I've been a nervous wreck about it for days. His first flight, and of course it ends up delayed." Nova circled closer to the stroller, her nose working overtime, showing the intense concentration that preceded an alert. The woman abruptly pulled the stroller back, creating distance. "Could you please call your dog off?" she asked, panic edging her voice. "I don't want him frightening the baby. Nova is very gentle with children," Drake said, noting her escalating anxiety. "She's actually specially trained to be around infants." This was a lie. Nova had no such specific training. But the woman's widened eyes and quickened breathing told him something important. A typical mother might be reassured by such information. This woman's anxiety visibly increased. "Still, I'd prefer if she stayed away." She insisted, moving the stroller again. "He's already upset enough." Nova let out a soft whine, a sound Drake recognized as frustration. The dog knew something was wrong and was trying to communicate it. "May I see your travel documents, please?" Drake asked, maintaining his professional demeanor while strategically shifting to block her path toward the exit. The woman fumbled in her shoulder bag, producing a U.S. passport that showed considerable wear. Drake examined it quickly. The document identified her as Sophia Lin, 32, with multiple Asian entry stamps over the past 5 years. Her baby's passport showed Lucas Lin, 7 months, with a single entry stamp from South Korea 2 weeks earlier. As the baby cried again, Drake noticed something odd about his movements in the stroller. The blanket didn't shift naturally with the child's motions. There seemed to be something rigid beneath it, restricting the infant's ability to move comfortably. "It seems like he's really uncomfortable," Drake commented. "Mind if I have a look? Sometimes buckles get twisted during flights." "No." The response came too quickly, too forcefully. She immediately attempted to soften it. "I mean, he's fine. I just changed him in the airplane bathroom. He just needs his crib and he'll settle down." Nova's posture had changed again, becoming more rigid, her attention unwavering from the stroller. In 3 years together, Drake had never seen her so fixated on an infant. She had encountered countless babies during screenings, typically giving them little more than a cursory sniff before moving on. "That's a lovely cross necklace," Drake observed, noting the gold chain around the woman's neck. Another attempt to establish rapport while gathering information, religious orientation. Her hand flew to her throat, touching the pendant. "Yes, it was my mother's." The baby cried again, a sound of genuine distress. Drake's concern deepened, not just for whatever contraband might be hidden, but for the infant's well-being. "Miss Lin, I understand you're tired and wanting to get through customs," he said, abandoning the casual approach. But my K9 partner is indicating that something requires further inspection, and I can see that your baby is in discomfort. I need to check the stroller. Fear flashed across her face, followed by an attempt at outrage. This is ridiculous. You're harassing a single mother because your dog is poorly trained. Drake made a strategic decision, gently tugging Nova's leash. Come, Nova, let's continue our rounds. To his surprise, Nova resisted something she had never done in their 3 years together. The Malinois planted her feet firmly, refusing to move away from the stroller. Instead of complying, she began to bark urgently, the sound echoing through the now quiet terminal. Several customs officers looked their way, including Supervisor Garcia, who approached rapidly. Control your dog. Sophia Lynn demanded, her face flushing with what appeared to be anger, but what Drake now recognized as fear. I apologize for the disturbance, Drake said, genuinely embarrassed by Nova's unprecedented behavior. Nevertheless, her insistence only strengthened his suspicion. In 3 years, she had never not once disobeyed a direct command unless there was significant cause. What's going on here, Drake? Garcia asked, her expression concerned. Sir, Nova has been alerting strongly to this passenger stroller. She's never behaved this way before. Nova suddenly lunged toward the stroller, again paused, landing on its edge. Sophia screamed, yanking it backward with enough force to nearly topple it. Get that animal away from my child! She shouted loud enough that all processing in the terminal had stopped. Drake quickly pulled Nova back. Nova down! He commanded firmly, and this time she complied, though her body remained tense. Eyes locked on the stroller. Garcia glanced between the agitated woman, the whimpering baby, and the still alert Malinois. Ms. Lynn, I apologize for any distress. Officer Drake is one of our most experienced handlers, and if his K9 is showing this level of concern, we do need to conduct a brief inspection. This is harassment, Sophia insisted, her voice shaking. I want to speak to someone higher up. Drake noticed her grip on the stroller had become almost desperate, her knuckles white against the handle. The baby continued to cry, his distress seemingly increasing. Ma'am, Drake said quietly, I'm genuinely concerned about your baby's comfort. Something seems to be causing him significant distress. Please let us check the stroller. If there's nothing of concern, you'll be on your way immediately with our sincere apologies. For a moment, indecision flickered across Sophia's face. The baby let out another cry, this one weaker, almost exhausted. No, she said, finally, her voice hardening. I won't have you traumatizing my child further. I know my rights. You need probable cause, not just a dog's behavior. Garcia stepped closer. Ms. Lynn, at International Borders, CBP has broad authority to conduct searches without warrants. Nova is a certified detection K9, and her alert constitutes sufficient grounds for inspection. After a tense standoff that lasted nearly a minute, Sophia's shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine, she whispered, but I want a female officer present, and I want this done in private. Garcia nodded to a nearby female officer. Officer Ramirez, please escort Miss Lynn to Secondary Inspection Room 3. Drake, you and Nova accompany them. The small procession moved through the terminal to a windowless room designed for more thorough customs examinations. The stark space contained only a metal table, several chairs, and a changing table for infants. A sterile environment that seemed to increase Sophia's agitation. Officer Elena Ramirez, a seasoned customs officer in her late 30s with a calm maternal demeanor, took position near the door. Garcia followed them in, closing the door to ensure privacy. First, I'll need to inspect your shoulder bag, Drake said, attempting to establish a methodical process that might ease tensions. Sophia reluctantly handed over the bag, which contained typical travel items, a change of clothes for the baby diapers, wipes, formula, her wallet, phone, and cosmetics. Nothing unusual or prohibited. Nova, however, remained fixated on the stroller, which now sat against the wall, with Lucas still strapped inside, his cries having subsided to exhausted whimpers. Now I need to examine the stroller. Drake said, would you mind lifting your son out? Sophia's body tensed visibly. He's finally settling down. If I move him, he'll start crying again. Miss Lynn, Garcia insisted, we need to inspect the stroller completely. Ma'am, and Officer Ramirez said softly, I'm a mother too. I know how protective we feel, but your baby seems uncomfortable. Let's make sure everything is okay. The combination of authority and empathy finally penetrated Sophia's resistance. Her composure, cracked eyes welling with tears. You don't understand, she whispered. Help us understand, Drake urged. Your baby's welfare comes first for all of us. With trembling hands, Sophia lifted Lucas from the stroller, cradling him against her chest. The infant, a beautiful child with dark hair and round cheeks, looked exhausted. His eyes half closed. Officer Ramirez will hold him while we check the stroller, Garcia instructed. No. Sophia clutched Lucas tighter. I won't hand him to strangers. Then please step back with your child, Drake said, approaching the empty stroller. Nova was already there, nose working intently over the baby blanket that remained in the seat. Drake carefully lifted it, revealing what appeared to be a standard stroller pad beneath. But as he ran his hand over the padding, he felt something unmistakable, a hard, unnatural shape beneath the fabric. Using his pocket knife, he carefully cut a small slit in the pad's seam, then pulled the opening wider. His breath caught as the metallic gleam of a handgun became visible, secured to the stroller's frame beneath the padding. Not just any handgun, a Glock 19 loaded with the safety off. Gun, he announced calmly, immediately stepping back and drawing his service weapon. Ma'am, please place the baby in the stroller and step away. The color drained from Sophia's face. It's not what you think. Place the baby in the stroller now. Garcia repeated, her hand also moving to her weapon. Tears streamed down Sophia's face as she gently placed the now sleeping Lucas back in the stroller, carefully avoiding the exposed weapon. He doesn't know, she whispered. He had nothing to do with this. Step back and place your hands behind your head, Drake instructed, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the adrenaline surging through his system. She complied, her body seeming to fold in on itself as she assumed the position. Garcia quickly secured her with handcuffs while Drake called for additional officers and an evidence team. Sophia Lynn, you're being detained for bringing an undeclared firearm through an international border. Garcia informed her, reciting her rights as Drake carefully secured the weapon. Upon closer inspection, the gun's serial number had been filed off, indicating it was likely stolen or intended for illegal use. Beneath the stroller padding, they also discovered a small plastic bag containing additional ammunition. As Officer Ramirez gently lifted Lucas, checking him for any injuries or signs of distress, Drake knelt beside Nova, who had finally relaxed now that the hidden threat had been revealed. Good girl, he whispered, running his hand along her sleek coat. You knew all along. The Malinois leaned against his leg briefly, their private moment of acknowledgement, before returning to the professional distance required during processing. Sophia stood silently, tears continuing to fall as she watched Officer Ramirez tend to her baby. Whatever her story was, Drake knew it was far more complicated than a simple smuggling attempt. No one risked bringing a concealed weapon through international customs with their infant strapped above it without profound desperation or fear. Ms. Lynn, Drake said, we need to know the truth now. Why were you bringing this weapon into the country, and whose safety were you concerned about? 3 hours later, Drake sat across from Sophia Lynn in the airport's security room. The stark fluorescent lighting emphasized the dark circles under her eyes and the tear tracks on her cheeks. Her handcuffs had been removed, a cup of untouched coffee cooling on the table before her. In the adjacent room, Officer Ramirez remained with Lucas, who had been examined by airport medical staff and declared healthy, though dehydrated and exhausted from the journey. The infant was now sleeping peacefully on a makeshift bed, created from blankets, unaware of the crisis unfolding around him. Agent Diana Powell from Homeland Security had joined the interview, adding her expertise in human trafficking and domestic violence cases that crossed international borders. At 48, Powell carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen humanity at its worst, but maintained her commitment to justice through compassion rather than cynicism. Mrs. Lynn. Drake began Nova, lying alertly at his feet. The weapon you were transporting has been identified as stolen from a gun shop in Portland 18 months ago. The penalties for international weapons smuggling are severe, 20 years minimum. If you're involved with arms trafficking cooperation, now is your best option. Sophia looked up, her eyes hollow with exhaustion, but suddenly fierce. I'm not a weapons dealer. I was trying to protect my son. From what? Powell asked, her voice gentle but probing. From his father, she replied, her voice breaking slightly. His name is Daniel Harrington. We met in Seattle 4 years ago when I was working as a translator for a tech company. He was charming, successful, everything I thought I wanted. Bitch. She paused, struggling to maintain composure. The abuse started after we were married. Small things at first, controlling my schedule, isolating me from friends, questioning my calls to family in Korea. Then it became physical. Why didn't you report it? Drake asked, though he knew the common reasons from his training in domestic violence awareness. I did once, she replied bitterly. The responding officers were his friends from his security company. Nothing happened except he punished me worse afterward. Her hand unconsciously moved to her ribs, suggesting an injury. There, Daniel has connections everywhere. Police, border patrol, private security. He told me no one would believe me, and he was right. And Lucas, Powell asked, when did you become pregnant? A year into our marriage, when I discovered I was pregnant, I thought it would change him. Sophia's expression darkened. It made him worse, said a child would ensure I could never leave him. Lucas is 5 months old, isn't he? Drake asked. Not 7 months as his passport states. Sophia nodded. I altered his birth certificate. Daniel has been searching for us since I left. I changed everything I could. Continue about when Lucas was born. Powell encouraged. Daniel became obsessed with controlling every aspect of his care. He installed cameras in the nursery, tracked my phone, followed me to pediatrician appointments. She took a sip of the now cold coffee, her hand steadier as she found her narrative rhythm. Then, one night, I overheard him on the phone planning to take Lucas to his parents in Montana without me. He said I was an unfit mother and he had evidence to prove it. What kind of evidence? Powell probed. Fabricated. He'd been recording me when I was exhausted editing videos to make it appear I was neglecting Lucas. He bribed one of the nurses from the hospital to provide a statement that I'd shown signs of postpartum psychosis. Her voice hardened. He was building a case to take my son and have me deported or committed to. Drake exchanged glances with Powell, both recognizing the sophisticated manipulation tactics common in high-control domestic situations. I knew then I had to leave, Sophia continued. My parents are in Seoul. My real parents, not the fake background I created in my customs declaration. I used cash I'd been hiding to buy tickets. Left in the middle of the night while Daniel was on a business trip. And the gun? Drake asked, returning to the immediate issue. Daniel has firearms everywhere. I took one from his collection before I left. I knew if he found us. She didn't finish the sentence. I couldn't leave it in Seoul with my parents. Korean gun laws are strict and I didn't want to endanger them. I was afraid to fly without protection. I know it was stupid, but I was desperate. Why come back to the U.S.? Powell questioned. Why not stay in South Korea? My visa was expiring. As a Korean citizen who had given up residency years ago, I could only stay temporarily. My parents are elderly with health problems. They couldn't come with me. She met Powell's gaze directly. I was planning to establish a new identity in Canada. I have distant relatives there who could help Lucas and me disappear. The story aligned with the evidence they'd gathered in the preliminary investigation. Sophia's passport contained a Korean citizenship stamp, not American as she'd initially portrayed. Calls to South Korean authorities had confirmed her parents' existence in Seoul and corroborated parts of her timeline. Ms. Lynn Powell said carefully, "We need to verify your claims about Daniel Harrington. Do you have documentation of the abuse, police reports, medical records, anything?" Sophia reached up to touch her cross necklace, a gesture Drake had noticed repeatedly throughout the interview. "The evidence is right here," she said quietly, twisting the gold cross to reveal a tiny USB drive built into its base. Videos from our home security system that Daniel didn't know I could access, in hospital records. I managed to download financial documents showing how he controlled all our accounts. Honey, everything is see. Powell took the USB drive, promising to review it immediately. As she left to arrange for a secure computer, Drake remained with Sofia Nova still attentive at his feet. "I understand why you felt you needed protection," he said after a moment of silence. "But bringing an unsecured weapon beneath your baby—" "I know," she interrupted, fresh tears welling. "I've replayed that decision 1,000 times. I was so focused on getting away that I didn't think clearly about all the risks to Lucas. The stroller was the only place Daniel would never search if he found us. He never once changed a diaper or adjusted Lucas's car seat. He considered baby care women's work." Nova had moved closer to Sofia, breaking protocol by placing her head gently on the woman's knee. Drake chose not to correct the behavior, recognizing that Nova's instincts about people had proven more reliable than standard procedures. "What happens now?" Sofia asked, her voice small. "Will I lose Lucas?" "That depends on what we verify." Drake replied honestly. "Weapons smuggling is a federal offense, but there are provisions for extreme circumstances. If your allegations are substantiated, we can involve domestic violence advocates and arrange protective measures." "He'll find us," she whispered, unconsciously stroking Nova's head. "Daniel always said if I ever left, he'd find me and take Lucas. Said no court would give custody to an unstable foreign woman over an American businessman with resources." Drake felt Nova shift beneath his hand, the dog having maintained her attentive posture throughout the interview. Her earlier behavior made perfect sense now. She hadn't just detected the weapon, but had sensed the woman's genuine fear and the baby's discomfort. "Miss Lynn," Drake said, making a decision he hoped wouldn't backfire. "I believe you, and I promise we'll do everything possible to keep you and Lucas safe while we investigate. But you need to trust the process and be completely honest with us moving forward." For the first time since they had encountered her, Sofia's expression showed something beyond fear, a fragile hope that perhaps this time someone would actually help. Siri or who evidence. The contents of Sofia Lynn's USB drive left no room for doubt about the reality of her situation. Security footage from the couple's Seattle home showed multiple instances of physical abuse. Daniel Harrington shoving Sofia into walls, dragging her by her hair, once even striking her while she was holding newborn Lucas. The timestamps and digital signatures had been verified by the forensic team as authentic and unaltered. Financial records revealed systematic isolation and control, with Daniel limiting Sofia's access to their joint accounts and monitoring every purchase through specialized software typically used by corporations for expense management. Medical records documented injuries clearly inconsistent with the accidental falls, noted in the reports, including a broken wrist, multiple bruises in various stages of healing, and the premature birth following what appeared to be a physical altercation. Most damning were recorded phone conversations where Daniel discussed using his connections to have Sofia deported or committed to psychiatric care if she ever attempted to leave him, including detailed plans to present fabricated evidence of her being an unfit mother. Agent Powell had immediately recognized the severity of the case and initiated a multi-agency response. Sofia and Lucas were moved to a secure women's shelter with round-the-clock protection from federal agents with no connection to Seattle law enforcement. Drake had personally vetted the security team, and Nova had accompanied them on the initial transfer. The dog's extraordinary senses providing an additional layer of protection, the investigation expanded beyond Sofia's immediate situation, revealing corruption extending to several local law enforcement officials who had buried previous domestic violence reports against not just Daniel, but other wealthy clients of his security firm. Federal charges for witness intimidation and evidence tampering were being prepared against multiple individuals. 2 weeks after the airport incident, Drake visited the shelter to update Sofia on the case's progress. The facility was disguised as an unremarkable apartment building in a middle-class Oakland neighborhood, its security features sophisticated but discreet. Sofia answered the door with Lucas in her arms, the infant now visibly healthier and more alert than when Drake had last seen him. The apartment wasn't luxurious. A small living room with basic furniture, a kitchenette, and a single bedroom, but it offered something her previous life had lacked: safety. Reinforced doors, security cameras, and panic buttons in every room provided physical protection, while the supportive environment of other survivors offered emotional security that Sophia had been denied for years. "Officer Drake," she greeted him, genuine warmth in her voice. "Please come in." "Just Mason when I'm off duty," he corrected gently. "How are you both settling in?" "Better each day," she replied, guiding him to the living area where toys were scattered across the floor. "Lucas is sleeping through the night now. The pediatrician says he's gaining weight properly." Drake noticed how she moved with more ease, the hypervigilance that had characterized her airport demeanor somewhat diminished. She still glanced at the windows, frequently still, startled at unexpected sounds. But the transformation was remarkable nonetheless. "I've brought some updates," Drake said, accepting the tea she offered. "The prosecutor has agreed to a deferred judgment on the weapons charge. Considering the extraordinary circumstances, you'll have probation and mandatory counseling with the possibility of expungement after 3 years." Relief washed over her face. "And Daniel, currently in federal custody, his bail was denied after evidence emerged that he had contacted associates about locating you." Drake hesitated before continuing. "The investigation into his security firm has uncovered more victims, Sophia. At least 3 other women with similar stories to yours. They've agreed to testify." She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this information. "I always wondered if there were others. Your evidence broke the case open. Without it, none of this would have happened." Drake set his cup down carefully. "There's something else. Agent Powell has arranged for you and Lucas to enter: witness protection, new identities, relocation to a different state, ongoing security until the trials are complete." Her voice was steady, determined. 3 days. You'll be briefed on all the details tomorrow. Once you're relocated, contact with anyone from your previous life will need to cease. That includes the investigation team." Sophia nodded, having clearly anticipated this development. "We'll be starting completely fresh. It's the safest option. Daniel's connections are extensive." Lucas made a soft noise from his portable crib, and Sophia immediately went to him. Lifting the baby with practiced tenderness, Drake noticed how the infant's eyes tracked his mother's face, the strong attachment evident in their interaction. "I've been meaning to ask," Drake said as Sophia returned with Lucas in her arms. "Why did you name him Lucas? Is there a family connection?" She smiled, watching her son reach for her necklace with curious fingers. "In Latin, Lucas means bringer of light. When I was pregnant and things were at their worst, I would talk to him when Daniel wasn't home. Tell him he was the light that would guide us to freedom." Her expression softened. "I just never expected that light would include a customs dog with extraordinary perception. Nova sensed something in you from the beginning." Drake acknowledged, "In 3 years, she's never disobeyed a command like that. She understood you were protecting Lucas, not smuggling for profit." "I'm getting a dog," Sophia said unexpectedly. "In our new location, the witness protection coordinator connected me with a program that matches trained security dogs with survivors of domestic violence." "That's an excellent idea. The trainer says having a dog changes everything. Not just the practical security, but the emotional support when you're starting over." She watched Lucas, gently patting her arm. "Men like Daniel target women they can isolate. A dog is a connection that can't be controlled." As Drake prepared to leave, Sophia hesitated at the door. "Once we relocate, I won't be able to thank you properly. You and Nova saved our lives, not just by finding us, but by believing me." "Nova believed you first," Drake said. "I just trusted her judgment." "Tell her," Sophia's voice caught, "tell her she saw past my mistakes to my intentions. That matters more than you know." And referring the development. The Daniel Harrington case triggered a cascade of investigations and reforms that extended far beyond Sophia and Lucas. As evidence mounted against Daniel's security firm, Sentinel Protection Services, a pattern of a systematic corruption emerged that implicated several Seattle police officers, 2 judges and a prosecutor, all of whom had received substantial financial benefits for bearing domestic violence cases. brought against wealthy clients. 6 months after the airport incident, Drake found himself in Washington, D.C., testifying before a congressional subcommittee on law enforcement integrity. The hearing room's formal atmosphere contrasted sharply with his usual working environment, but the importance of the moment kept his focus razor-sharp. Officer Drake Bauer, the committee chairwoman, addressed him. "Your report indicates that your K-9 partner exhibited unusual behavior during this encounter. Could you elaborate on what made the situation distinct from the standard contraband detection?" Drake leaned slightly toward the microphone. Nova's alert was fundamentally different from her trained response to narcotics or prohibited items. Rather than the excited indication she displays for contraband, she showed what I can only describe as protective concern. She physically positioned herself between Miss Lynn's stroller and other personnel, and she refused a direct command to disengage, something she had never done in 3 years of service. "Are you suggesting your K-9 somehow intuited that Miss Lynn was a victim rather than a perpetrator despite the presence of an illegal firearm?" The skepticism in the congressman's voice was evident. What I'm suggesting, sir, is that working dogs process sensory information more comprehensively than our training protocols typically acknowledge. Drake chose his words carefully. Nova detected the weapon, but she also perceived contextual information about Miss Lynn's emotional state and the infant's distress that influenced her response pattern. Deo. This testimony, along with Agent Powell's comprehensive report on the Sentinel investigation, ultimately contributed to the Justice Department's launch of a nationwide review of domestic violence cases involving private security firms and law enforcement partners. Training standards for Customs and Border Protection officers were expanded to include specific modules on recognizing indicators of human trafficking and domestic violence among international travelers. Meanwhile, Nova's unusual behavior had caught the attention of canine behavior specialists. Dr. Eleanor Fujita, a cognitive researcher from the University of California's Animal Cognition Laboratory, approached Drake about including Nova in a groundbreaking study on empathetic responses in working dogs. "What we're discovering," Dr. Fujita explained during their first meeting at her Berkeley campus office, "is that certain dogs possess an extraordinary capacity to distinguish between identical contraband carried for different purposes. It's not just about detecting the substance or object. It's about integrating that detection with human behavioral cues to form a more sophisticated threat assessment." The research program occupied much of Drake's off-duty time over the following months. While he and Nova continued their regular customs work at San Francisco International, they also participated in carefully designed experiments at Dr. Fujita's lab, where Nova consistently demonstrated her ability to distinguish between volunteers carrying identical substances with different intents. One instructed to act as a smuggler, another as someone who had simply forgotten to declare the item. "She's not just smelling the substance," Dr. Fujita observed reviewing video footage of Nova's differential responses. "She's reading microexpressions, body language, even subtle changes in respiration and perspiration that indicate deception versus confusion or fear." What's extraordinary is that she's integrating these cues into her decision-making without specific training for these distinctions. The implications of this research extended beyond security applications. A pilot program began placing dogs from similar working lines with domestic violence intervention teams, where their unique sensitivity to emotional distress and concealment provided an additional layer of assessment during welfare checks and protection order enforcement. As for Daniel Harrington, the federal case against him had grown to include charges of witness intimidation, evidence tampering, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy under RICO statutes. His assets had been frozen, his security firm dissolved, and his once powerful network of corrupt officials was unraveling under the weight of multiple cooperating witnesses. Throughout the transformation, 18 months after their initial encounter at San Francisco International, Drake received an official communication through secure channels from the Witness Protection Program. The message was brief: an address in Portland, a date 2 weeks hence, in clearance for both Drake and Nova to conduct a follow-up assessment. The Daniel Harrington trials had concluded with lengthy federal sentences for not only Daniel but several of his associates, with the immediate danger diminished the restrictions on Sophia's, now known as Claire Bennett, contact with case officers had been cautiously relaxed. When Drake arrived at the modest craftsman house in a quiet residential neighborhood, he was struck by how ordinary it appeared. A small front garden with autumn flowers, a child's tricycle on the porch, a wind chime tinkling softly in the October breeze. Nova sat up in the back seat of his SUV, recognizing the significance of this visit with a soft whine of anticipation. "Yes, we're visiting them," Drake confirmed, smiling at his partner's enthusiasm. "But remember best behavior around Lucas." The front door opened before they reached it, revealing Sophia looking transformed. Her hair was shorter, highlighted with subtle auburn streaks. Her face had filled out, the haunted thinness replaced by healthy vitality. Beside her stood a golden retriever with attentive eyes and a professional bearing that Drake immediately recognized as service dog training. "Mason Nova," she greeted them with genuine warmth. "Please come in." The home was modestly furnished but comfortable, with children's books stacked on the coffee table and colorful artwork adorning the walls. Photos showed Lucas, now a toddler with chubby cheeks and bright eyes, playing in a park, sitting in a high chair, covered in birthday cake and cuddling with the golden retriever. Lucas himself appeared from the hallway, wobbling on legs, still mastering the art of walking. He spotted Nova and squealed with delight, pointing and looking up at his mother for permission. "Gentle with Nova," Sophia reminded him as Drake guided his partner to lie down, allowing the toddler to approach safely. "This is Beacon." Sophia introduced the golden retriever, who maintained a protective position beside her. "He's from that program I mentioned, trained specifically for domestic violence survivors. He does security sweeps of the house, alerts to unexpected visitors, and has been trained to press the panic button if needed." Drake watched as Lucas cautiously patted Nova's head, the Malinois displaying remarkable patience with the clumsy toddler touches. "How's the new teaching position?" he asked him. After relocating, Sophia had earned an accelerated teaching certification, using her language skills to secure a position at a private elementary school, teaching Korean to young children. "Money. Wonderful. The school has excellent security and Lucas loves the daycare program there." She smiled, watching her son's interaction with Nova. "We're building a good life here. Different from what I imagined, but good." As Lucas tired of Nova and toddled off to play with toys in the corner, Beacon following attentively, Sophia's expression grew more serious. "They're publishing a case study about Daniel's network in the Journal of Law Enforcement Ethics," she said quietly. "Agent Powell sent me an advance copy. My real name isn't used, of course, but seeing it all laid out clinically, the systematic way he isolated victims, the corruption he cultivated in local police, it's still difficult to process. The case has changed protocols for domestic violence reports involving security professionals." Drake told her, "New oversight requirements, mandatory reporting to federal authorities. Your courage made that happen." She shook her head slightly. "Not courage, desperation. Sometimes they're the same thing." Lucas returned with a picture book, plopping himself unceremoniously in Drake's lap and opening it expectantly. Drake laughed, surprised by the child's comfort with him, despite their limited interactions. "He remembers you somehow," Sophia said, watching them with a soft expression. "Or maybe he just senses you're safe." After reading the book twice, Drake helped Lucas build a tower of block, while Sophia prepared tea. Nova and Beacon had established a professional camaraderie, lying near each other, but maintaining their respective vigilance over their humans. "I've been meaning to ask," Drake said as Lucas finally tired and crawled into his mother's lap. "That night at the airport, were you afraid when Nova approached the stroller?" "Terrified," Sophia admitted, "but not because I thought she would hurt Lucas. I was afraid of what would happen once the gun was discovered." She stroked her son's hair as he dozed against her. "But when I looked into Nova's eyes, there was something there, an understanding, like she knew I wasn't a threat, just threatened." Sani Montarni. "She's always had that ability to sense intention beyond action." Drake glanced fondly at his partner. "The trainers call it a liability. I call it wisdom, on the way, legacy." 3 years after the airport incident, the case that had begun with a dog's disobedience had inspired fundamental changes in multiple systems. The Harrington investigation had exposed corruption that extended beyond Seattle, leading to nationwide reforms in how domestic violence cases involving powerful defendants were handled. Nova's unusual behavior had sparked research that was revolutionizing understanding of canine cognition and expanding applications for service dogs in trauma recovery and law enforcement. For Drake, the most significant outcome was the establishment of the Contextual Detection Training Program, a specialized unit within CBP that trained officers and their canine partners to recognize the complex behavioral indicators that distinguish genuine security threats from desperate survival measures. The program, which Drake now directed alongside his regular duties, had already prevented several potential tragedies at border crossings and international terminals. On a crisp autumn morning, 5 years after their first encounter, Drake stood before a gathering of law enforcement officers, K-9 handlers, domestic violence advocates, and researchers at the official inauguration of the renamed Nova Center for Integrated Security and Human Services at San Francisco International Airport. The facility represented a new approach to border security, one that acknowledged the complex human stories behind apparent violations and provided appropriate interventions rather than simple enforcement. Traditional security paradigms train us to see clear boundaries between law-abiding and law-breaking behaviors. Drake explained in his dedication speech, "But human experience rarely conforms to such distinct categories. The individuals we encounter at our borders often operate in gray areas, fleeing violence, seeking medical treatment, reuniting with family actions that may technically violate regulations while serving fundamentally protective purposes." Nova sat beside him on the small platform, her poised presence lending weight to his words. At 8 years old, she still maintained her working schedule, though Drake had begun transitioning her toward a training role where her extraordinary perceptiveness could be studied and hopefully transmitted to younger dogs. What Nova taught us that night 5 years ago wasn't just about one family story. It was about the limitations of our perception when we focus exclusively on what someone is doing rather than why they're doing it. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled during the reception, Drake noticed a familiar figure entering the hall. Sophia, now using her witness protection identity as Claire Bennett, accompanied by Lucas, now a school-aged child, with his mother's observant eyes and an easy smile that spoke of security and stability. Beside them walked Beacon, the golden retriever, wearing his service dog vest. Their presence was an extraordinary exception to witness protection protocols, approved only after extensive security assessment, confirmed that Daniel Harrington's network had been completely dismantled and that all significant threats had been neutralized. The federal prosecutor had agreed that their attendance at this landmark event, disguised as a professional development opportunity related to Sophia's current work with the domestic violence prevention program, represented minimal risk and significant symbolic importance. Lucas spotted Nova immediately and approached with the confidence of a child who had grown up with dogs, extending his hand palm down, as he'd been taught. Nova, recognizing him, despite the years between their meetings, gently touched her nose to his hand in greeting. "I tell your story when I visit schools," Lucas announced, his voice carrying the straightforward certainty of childhood, "about how you knew my mom needed help even when she couldn't ask for it." Drake smiled, kneeling to the child's level. "Nova would be honored to know that Beacon helps people too," Lucas continued, gesturing to the golden retriever. "He visits mom's support groups and knows when someone needs extra attention. Mom says he learned it from watching videos of Nova." Sophia approached, extending her hand to Drake. "Congratulations on the center. It's going to help a lot of families like ours. Your testimony made it possible." Drake replied, "This is your legacy as much as Nova's." "Speaking of legacies," Sophia said, retrieving a folder from her bag, "Lucas wanted to show you this. See?" The folder contained a school project, a carefully handwritten story illustrated with crayon drawings, depicting a brave dog helping a mother and baby escape from a shadowy figure. The final page showed the mother and child in a sunny house with their own dog surrounded by flowers and a rainbow. "My teacher said we should write about heroes," Lucas explained seriously, "Real ones, not just in movies." As the formal program concluded and attendees began to depart, Drake escorted Sophia and Lucas to their car, Nova walking beside them with the dignified awareness of a dog who understood her role in their shared history. "We've been cleared to maintain limited contact going forward," Sophia said as they reached the parking area. "The U.S. Attorney's Office believes the threat level has diminished sufficiently. They're actually using our case as a model for how witness protection can evolve toward reintegration when appropriate." "I'm glad," Drake replied. "Lucas should know the full story of how brave his mother was, how she protected him when everyone else failed." "Not everyone failed," Sophia corrected gently. She knelt beside Nova, meeting the dog's intelligent gaze directly. "Thank you for seeing past what I was doing to why I was doing it. Thank you for saving us both." Nova responded with a gentle press of her nose against Sophia's hand, a gesture that needed no translation. As they drove away, Drake glanced at Nova in the rearview mirror. "You knew she wasn't a criminal from the start, didn't you? You sensed she was protecting her child, not smuggling for profit." Nova's ears perked forward at the sound of his voice, her expression somehow conveying both wisdom and innocence simultaneously. Drake smiled, returning his attention to the road ahead. Sometimes the truest understanding came not from evidence or logic, but from instinct, that ancient wisdom that humans had largely forgotten how to trust. In a world of rules and regulations of black and white thinking, Nova had recognized the gray areas where humanity's most profound stories unfolded. And in doing so, she had not just enforced the law, but honored its deepest purpose to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to recognize that sometimes the most dangerous journeys are undertaken not for profit or power, but for love. The ripple effect. 6 months after the Nova Center's inauguration, Drake found himself in an unexpected position, standing at the back of a crowded university lecture hall as Dr. Eleanor Fujita presented her team's groundbreaking research on empathetic responses in working dogs. The audience, a mix of psychology students, animal behavior specialists, and law enforcement personnel, listened with rapt attention as slide after slide of brain imaging studies demonstrated the unique neural activities observed in dogs like Nova during complex assessment scenarios. "What we're discovering," Dr. Fujita explained, gesturing to a particularly complex chart, "challenges our fundamental understanding of cognition across species boundaries. These dogs aren't simply detecting substances or objects, they're integrating contextual information, emotional states, and environmental factors to form assessments that can only be described as moral discernment." Nova lay at Drake's feet, seemingly unimpressed by her newfound scientific significance. At home that evening, as Drake reviewed the final manuscript of Dr. Fujita's paper before its publication in Science, he reflected on how far their journey had taken them from that rainy night at San Francisco International. The research findings had implications beyond security applications. A specialized breeding program had been established to identify and develop dogs with Nova's unique perceptual abilities. Descendants of her littermates were now being placed with domestic violence shelters, refugee processing centers, and pediatric trauma units, environments where the distinction between fear and deception could be critical to providing appropriate intervention. The following morning brought another significant development. Drake's phone chimed with a message from Sophia. "The legal team received final confirmation today. Daniel's last appeal has been denied. All assets forfeited. The formal threat assessment has been downgraded to minimal. Lucas and I are officially graduating from witness protection. We'll keep our new identities, we've grown attached to them, but we're free to live without restrictions now. I've accepted a position directing a new advocacy center for immigrant domestic violence survivors. Our story continues to create ripples. Thank you for being the first to believe us." Attached was a photo of Lucas, now 7 years old, proudly holding a martial arts trophy beacon, sitting attentively beside him. The transformation from the distressed infant in the airport stroller to this confident child represented everything their work was meant to accomplish, not just the enforcement of laws, but the protection of possibilities. That afternoon, as Drake and Nova conducted their routine patrol through Terminal G, they passed the spot where their extraordinary case had begun. The airport had changed significantly in the intervening years. Renovations had modernized the space, new security technologies had been integrated. Different shops occupied the retail locations, yet something essential remained unchanged: the constant flow of human stories passing through this liminal space, each traveler carrying their own complex mixture of hopes, fears, responsibilities, and dreams. A young officer approached a German shepherd at his side. "Officer Drake, I'm Harris, just transferred from JFK. This is Rex." The handler gestured to his partner with evident pride. "We've been assigned to your contextual detection unit." Drake nodded in greeting. "Welcome to San Francisco. How familiar are you with our protocols?" "Studied all the materials, sir. The case studies, especially the Lynn file." Harris looked down at Nova with undisguised admiration. "It's an honor to meet the dog who changed the whole approach to K9 assessment." Nova acknowledged the recognition with typical dignity, maintaining her professional demeanor while conducting a subtle evaluation of the newcomer and his partner. "The most important thing to understand," Drake explained as they continued their patrol, "is that we're not just looking for what people are carrying, we're trying to understand why they're carrying it. The distinction can mean the difference between intercepting a genuine threat and recognizing someone who needs protection rather than prosecution." As they walked, Drake noticed Nova's attention shift toward the international arrivals area. Her ears pricked forward, body language signaling interest rather than alert. He followed her gaze to an elderly couple being assisted by a flight attendant, the woman in a wheelchair, her husband hovering protectively beside her. "Let's check it out," Drake suggested to Harris. "Watch how Nova approaches this. Isn't an alert for contraband, it's something else." They approached the couple calmly, Nova taking the lead with the precise, measured pace she used for welfare assessments rather than enforcement. The elderly man looked up anxiously as they neared. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins. "Not at all, sir," Drake replied reassuringly. "My partner just wanted to check that everything's okay. You've traveled a long way. From Ukraine through Warsaw." The man explained, relaxing slightly at Drake's friendly tone. "My wife, she has medical condition. We are coming to stay with our daughter during treatments." Nova had positioned herself beside the wheelchair, her demeanor gentle and attentive. The elderly woman reached out a trembling hand to touch the dog's head. "She knows," the woman said softly in heavily accented English. "Dogs always know." Drake noticed the custom declaration form clutched in the man's hand. Several medication boxes checked, but with a question mark beside the quantity field. "Sir, do you have medications with you for your wife's condition?" Drake asked. The man's expression grew worried. "Yes, many. Some are special treatments not approved here. Yet our doctor in Kiev arranged compassionate use permission, but we are not sure if documents are correct." Rather than immediately moving to inspection mode, Drake gestured toward a quieter area of the terminal. "Let's find somewhere more comfortable to review your documentation. There are medical exemptions for treatments in many cases, especially for compassionate use. We want to make sure you have everything you need for your wife's care." As they helped the couple to a seating area, Harris whispered to Drake, "Technically, we should take them to secondary inspection for formal review. We will," Drake assured him, "but we'll do it in a way that addresses their medical needs. First enforcement, second." That's what the contextual detection approach is about, recognizing the human situation behind the regulatory framework. Nova remained beside the elderly woman, her presence providing visible comfort. The Malinois had positioned herself protectively, exhibiting the same quality of discernment she had shown with Sophia and Lucas. Years earlier, recognizing vulnerability rather than violation, need rather than intent to deceive her. This is what she taught us. Drake explained to Harris as they waited for the medical liaison officer to arrive. Sometimes what looks like non-compliance is actually desperation. Our job isn't just to enforce borders, but to understand why people cross them. As the couple's situation was assessed and appropriate permissions arranged for their medically necessary items, Drake watched Nova's continued attentiveness to the elderly woman. The dog who had once broken protocol to protect a mother and child was still expanding the definition of security, still teaching that true protection required wisdom beyond rules, perception beyond training. In the years since that rainy night at Customs, Nova's legacy had grown from a single act of disobedience into a philosophy that was transforming how borders were managed, how vulnerability was recognized, and how justice was defined. What had begun with her refusal to follow a command had evolved into a deeper understanding that true security came not from rigid enforcement, but from the capacity to distinguish between those who meant harm and those who were simply trying to survive. As Drake and Harris completed the couple's processing and ensured they were comfortably reunited with their waiting daughter, Nova received a final pat from the elderly woman. "Special dog," she said simply, "knows the heart, not just the rules. Come." Drake couldn't have described Nova's gift more perfectly himself. Showa the Bobu understanding. On Nova's 10th birthday, her last year of active service before official retirement, Drake arranged a special celebration at their home, a modest cabin on a wooded acre north of the city. The gathering brought together the extended family that had formed around their partnership, Dr. Fujita and her research team, several handlers from the Contextual Detection Unit, Agent Powell, now Deputy Director Powell, and most significantly, Sophia and Lucas, who had been granted permission to attend under their new identities. Lucas, now 8, had grown into a thoughtful, observant child with his mother's perceptiveness and a confidence that spoke of secure attachment. He presented Nova with a handmade scrapbook chronicling the adventures of Nova the hero dog, illustrated with surprisingly skilled drawings and filled with stories both real and imagined. "I'm writing a real book about her someday," he informed Drake seriously. "People need to know that sometimes breaking rules is the right thing to do." "A sophisticated moral perspective for someone your age," Drake observed, impressed. Lucas shrugged. "Mom says I was there at the beginning, so I understand better than most grown-ups." Sophia, now directing an advocacy center for immigrant survivors of domestic violence, had brought news of the program's expansion. "We're incorporating canine therapy teams in all our locations now," she explained as they watched Nova interact gently with the children present. "The research shows trauma survivors respond more rapidly when dogs are part of the therapy protocol. It creates safety on a neurological level that human interventions alone can't achieve." Dr. Fujita joined their conversation, adding her scientific perspective. "What's particularly fascinating is how this response appears to be reciprocal. The dogs show distinctive neurological patterns when working with trauma survivors, different from their responses to other human distress. It's as if they recognize and respond specifically to the aftermath of human-caused harm." As the celebration continued, Drake found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with what appeared to be a training failure, a dog disobeying a direct command, and had evolved into a reconceptualization of what security truly meant. Nova hadn't failed her training that night. She had transcended it, demonstrating understanding beyond the parameters of her conditioning. Later, as the guests departed and the autumn evening settled around their cabin, Drake sat on the porch with Nova beside him, watching the gathering darkness transform the forest into mysterious silhouettes. The Malinois rested her head on his knee, gray now frosting her muzzle, but her eyes still holding the same keen intelligence that had guided their partnership for a decade. "You changed more lives than you know," he told her, stroking the soft fur between her ears. "Not just Sophia and Lucas, but all the others who'll benefit from what you taught us about looking beyond the surface." Nova's tail swept gently across the porch boards, acknowledgement without need for human language. In the decade of their partnership, Drake had come to understand that the limitation had never been in her comprehension, but in the human tendency to underestimate the depth of canine perception. The following morning, as they prepared for one of their final shifts together before Nova's retirement, Drake received an unexpected communication. A message from the Department of Justice included a secure video file with a brief note from the prosecutor. "Thought you and Nova should see this, the final chapter." The video showed Daniel Harrington in prison attire, seated across from investigators in an institutional interview room. His once commanding presence had diminished. Shoulders hunched, the arrogance in his expression replaced by the calculation of someone who had finally recognized the complete collapse of his power. We're prepared to recommend a sentence reduction in exchange for your cooperation regarding the remaining members of your network, the lead investigator stated. Harrington's response was immediate. I want full immunity and witness protection. There are people involved who won't hesitate to silence me permanently. Ironic, the investigator commented. You're requesting the same protection you tried to deny Sophia Lynn and your son. Harrington's expression hardened. I never intended to harm my child. Everything I did was to maintain control of what was mine, including attempting to have Miss Lynn committed to psychiatric care based on fabricated evidence, including corrupting law enforcement to prevent her from escaping your abuse. I did what was necessary. Harrington insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. If that dog hadn't interfered at the airport, let's be clear, the investigator interrupted. It wasn't just the dog. Your ex-wife demonstrated extraordinary courage and foresight in documenting your abuse. The dog simply recognized what you had forced her to conceal. Drake closed the video, a complex mixture of emotions washing through him. The final dismantling of Harrington's remaining network would bring closure to the case, but the man's continued inability to recognize the humanity of those he had harmed was a stark reminder of why their work mattered so profoundly. He looked at Nova waiting patiently by the door for their day to begin. Ready for one of our last shifts together, girl. The Malinois responded with her characteristic dignity, moving to stand beside him with the quiet confidence that had defined their partnership. As they headed toward the car, Drake realized that while Nova's active service might be ending, her legacy would continue to reshape how humans understood security, justice, and the recognition of vulnerability. In the years ahead, as Nova transitioned to a quieter life, as his companion rather than his working partner, her influence would continue through the training programs she had inspired, the research her abilities had catalyzed, and the fundamental shift in perspective she had initiated. Dogs like her were already working in refugee centers, domestic violence shelters, and border crossings around the world, bringing their extraordinary perceptiveness to the complex human dramas that unfolded in these spaces. What had begun as a single moment of canine disobedience had evolved into a philosophy that recognized security as something far more nuanced than the enforcement of boundaries. True security, Nova had taught them, came from the wisdom to distinguish between those who meant harm and those who were simply trying to protect what mattered most. A discernment that transcended training, defied protocols, and ultimately served the deeper purpose for which such protocols existed. As they arrived at San Francisco International for one of their final shifts together, Drake watched Nova step confidently into the terminal that had been the setting for their most significant case. Around them, travelers moved through the space, each carrying their own complex stories, their own reasons for crossing borders, their own mixtures of hope and fear and determination. And moving among them with the quiet certainty of one who understood the difference between the letter of law and its spirit, Nova continued her unassuming work, not just detecting what people carried, but recognizing who they were and why they carried it. In that recognition lay the true essence of security, the deepest meaning of protection, and the most profound legacy of the Guardian's instinct that had saved a mother and child on a rainy night 5 years before.